So I'm Anna. I'm Anna Bradley, the Executive Director at Sentient Media, and this is our fourth in our six-part series, Sentient Sessions. And today we have how to build an investigative story with Lee Fang, investigative journalist at The Intercept. So thanks everybody for coming and joining us today. For those of you who are new to Sentient Media, we're a non-profit journalism organisation, and we primarily report and offer commentary on the corruption within the industrial animal industries. And we work to try and bring these stories to the mainstream. We offer training programs for activists and for writers. We partner with publications, and we provide strategic digital marketing to help those within the movement get more visibility. One of the things that's at our core is seeking how to find out how we can help people better tell their stories and seek new ways to uncover truths about the corruption within animal industries, and basically get them seen by new audiences, getting out of the vegan echo chamber. And that's one of the reasons we started Sentient Sessions, open for everybody who's interested in social justice with the written word. And over the last 12 months, we've been evolving our training programs. We're working with a variety of writers, and essentially we've come to the conclusion that when it comes to justice for non-human animals, it's time to change the narrative from the old shock and horror approach to something a bit different, to uncover new details and find unlikely heroes, and show how corruption, for example, in big ag, actually impacts everybody and get to the root of those stories. So that's why I'm super excited about our guest today, Lee, because I believe we have a lot to learn from his approach to building investigations, finding the hook that reaches beyond echo chambers. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about Lee before we kick things off. He actually graduated in government and politics in 2009 and co-founded republicreport.org in 2012 and joined The Intercept in 2015. His work really tends to explore how public policy is influenced by organised interest groups and, of course, money. His work has been published by Vice, The BAFTA, Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, Indies Times, Huffington Post, etc. And he broke the Koch brothers case, which has been used to form documentaries and obviously HBO's The Newsroom. Throughout his career at The Intercept, he's reported on corruption within politics and money, which has, as a lot of people who are on this call will know, naturally led him to industrial animal agriculture. And he worked with Glenn Greenwald and Leighton Woodhouse in 2018 to cover the story of animal rights activists in California, who were charged with multiple felony counts exposing how prosecutors were abusing the law to silence these activists. So, I mean, that's an example of him using like a focus on the corruption of the criminal justice system rather than the suffering of the animals to tell this story, which is really interesting. And of course, he's got his long form piece, the Playbook for Poisoning the Earth, which I recommend you all read. It's one of my favorite long form articles where he's investigating a sophisticated information war which has kept these dangerous insecticides, which are toxic to bees and birds and are banned in the EU. But this information war has essentially kept them live on the US market. So yeah, following the money, following the law, following the interest groups seems to allow Lee to uncover these corruptions and bring them to light. We're going to hear from Lee. He's got a presentation for us, and then we're going to run over into a Q&A. So you can line up your questions. You can type them in at the bottom throughout, and we'll get to them at the end. But yeah, Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. And I can't wait to hear everything you've got for us. So over to you.
Anna, thank you, and thanks for having me. Appreciate being hosted by Sentient Media, and I'm excited to do this. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about my process and then some tactics for gathering information to form the backbone of an investigative news story, and how I've done it for some of my pieces. But then I really want to get it to Q&A and hear from you so I can understand and hear and just give my perspective to your concerns and your interest in investigative reporting. I've been reporting, as Anna mentioned, for about a decade now, writing a range of different types of news stories and investigative news stories concerning politics, American politics, but also the nexus of influence between organized interest groups, business, and the public policy process. And that's taken a lot of formats. I've written for news blogs, for magazines, for newspapers. And, every reporter has their own process, how they go about gathering information for news and how they go about reporting the news. For the purposes of this webinar, I just want to make a distinction between the different types of news. Obviously there's opinion, which is just giving your own take or perspective on a social phenomenon or, something going on in society. And there's news reporting, breaking news reporting, just describing events of the day that have happened, whether that's, a fire or a new opening of a business or whatever. Investigative reporting is a little bit different in the sense that it can be broad, but it can also be very focused. But what makes it distinct is that you are finding new information that has not been reported before, that is perhaps concealed or obscured in some way, that reveals something important or something that reflects the public interest about a powerful person, a system, a process that shapes the world we live in. And that's pretty broad, but it can be applied in many different ways. And for a lot of my reporting, some of it is in the field, talking to experts or powerful people, and sussing out information that way. But a lot of it's done just at the computer, finding information through documents that are disclosed online, talking to sources online, filing document requests online, looking at data that's revealed through a variety of government sources, and finding patterns within that data or significant outliers in that data that tell a story. And, I've written about animal ag, about the factory farming process and that influence over society. But this kind of way of I report the news can be really applied to a lot of different subject areas, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's climate change, whether it's workers' rights, healthcare, what have you. And like I said, reporters take a variety of different means for doing this. Some reporters will get very close to a source or get close to a government or business figure, and there's kind of an exchange. They're given an exclusive from that source with the kind of tacit understanding that they will report the news in a certain way. So if you're new to journalism, new to investigative reporting, I think one of the best things you can do is to just read the news in a different way. Every time you open the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or your local newspaper, read it for new facts. When you're reading a story, look at what types of information are truly new nuggets that have not been revealed before, and think about how that reporter obtained those facts. Did they find them in a judicial docket? Did they find it from a government source? Did it come from a document that was given to them, or something that they obtained through some means? 80 or 90% of every story you see in the news has a lot of fluff, just stuff that's given that's perhaps necessary context so you can understand why that information is being presented, how it connects to the news of the day, or a narrative that's been told all year. But usually there's one or two nuggets of truly new information, and just constantly think, how did that reporter find that information? Was it given to them? Did they seek it out and obtain it? And perhaps is it publicly available? Is it something that you could find and duplicate on your own? And I think once you start getting into this process, and this can be applied to historical reporting too, like look at the big stories that reported in the 90s or early aughts, and again, just apply this analysis. Where did that information come from? How is it obtained? And how can you learn to find that information to do your own reporting? So as Anna mentioned, I do a lot of reporting on money and politics. I prepared a short presentation that looks at some of the dynamics around campaign finance and the rules around that and the way to go about it. So I want to share screen and get into that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my own reporting and the various online ways to obtain information. So let's see if I can get this started. Okay. So if you're reporting on money, campaign finance in the United States, there are several Supreme Court cases that really govern the way that money is given and received in elections. But two of the major decisions are Buckley v. Vallejo in the 70s, which basically eviscerated any legislative attempt, any statutory attempt to limit the amount of money that can be spent in politics. So in America, you can spend unlimited amounts, whether you're a small candidate or a big corporation. You can spend unlimited amounts. If you're a political action committee, again, there are no caps on how much you spend. There are caps on how much you can raise, and we'll get to that in a second. The second big decision was in 2010, the Citizens United decision. This decision basically deregulated the amount that can be raised and spent, as long as the group raising and spending the money is independent of a candidate or a politician. So that created the phenomenon of super PACs, these special political vehicles that can raise and spend unlimited amounts from unions, from individuals, from corporations. They've given incredible leverage to special interest groups that are very well heeled. They can raise unlimited amounts of money. But in terms of politicians, there are still many restrictions that apply when giving direct money to an individual candidate. And it's important to familiarize yourself with the various restrictions. And this is just for the federal level. And you should be going to the Federal Elections Commission and other sites that govern this to just look at the rules that are set up, how much an individual can give to a candidate, to a political action committee, to a political party, and so forth. Another important way to look at this is to think about the schedules. No matter what jurisdiction you're in, there's some kind of deadline for campaign finance reporting. This table on the screen now reflects the federal schedule for reporting campaign finance for quarterly filers. And once you become a presidential campaign and some other types of campaigns, there's a slightly different schedule, especially coming into an election year. But generally speaking, this is the quarterly filing schedule. So when these deadlines come up, candidates and PACs have to disclose all the money they raise and spend during that certain time period. Some things to think about for every jurisdiction, whether you're running for mayor in a small town or running for president, the data is collected in a different way. Kind of depends on the jurisdiction and the type of laws that govern it. On the federal level, there is an API, which is kind of like a way to connect to the raw fire hose of information. But new filings aren't digitized immediately. I think typically there's a two or three week turnaround. So when filings go in, you can't text search a name, can't text search, whatever you're looking for. You're going to have to look at the actual physical filing. So that's pulling up the PDFs. Sometimes, and for some local offices, that means actually pulling up the documents that are handwritten and reading them. You're not going to always be able to find everything through just a text search of all the bulk data. Also be mindful of the various ways that data can appear in these types of filings. Names can be abbreviated. They could be hyphenated. Samantha could come up as Sam. Someone could put their PO box rather than their address. There are a lot of ways that if you're doing searches, you want to be sure to check for every kind of iteration of a name. Note that in most U.S. campaign finance law, if you are a business and you provide a service to a politician, that's counted as a donation as what's called an in-kind contribution. So you just have to be mindful that if you see that, some kind of rec center gave what looks like a big donation to a candidate, that might just be allowing them to use the space. That's a distinction that you should be wary of. And of course, there's kind of a shell game in a lot of these filings. Rather than giving directly to a candidate and perhaps being associated with that candidate or that donor, which might have some kind of reputational issue around them, a lot of interest groups and donors will give to a political action committee that gives to another political action committee that gives to another political action committee that then advocates or gives on a candidate's behalf. That way to kind of distance their name while still providing that benefit. So that's labor intensive, but something to look for. This slide just mentions that there are different types of political action committees. Super PACs are the groups that are enabled by Citizens United that can raise and spend unlimited amounts, although by law they're not supposed to coordinate with any candidates or politicians that they are seeking to defeat or benefit, although that law is sometimes skirted. On the federal level, politicians can form leadership PACs that fundraise on behalf of other politicians. Corporations and unions can form their own special PACs that typically raise money from their members. And also there's always a distinction depending on the jurisdiction you're in. So in federal and state politics, these campaign accounts have to be separate. Also, just from wherever you're reporting, if you're reporting on animal ag issues in South Dakota, they have their own campaign finance system. Familiarize yourself with the law. Every state and jurisdiction, those laws are governed by a different body. Some places it's an ethics commission, other places it's the Secretary of State. I just have a jumble of different sites. The UK Election Commission here, if you wanted to look at money in politics in the UK, or the Federal Elections Commission for federal politics in the US. Here's the San Francisco ethics site. They're all, there are similar elements in each of these sites, but a lot of them are radically different. You can find radically different types of information with their own disclosure schedules. So really familiarizing yourself with the different forms, when they're filed, and what you can find from them is important for any of this type of reporting. And this is the growing phenomenon in the US. It's a bipartisan kind of issue. Both Democrats and Republicans are increasingly using dark money, typically through various types of corporations that, if I wanted to give to a politician and conceal my name, there are various legal vehicles to do so. Donating to an LLC is one way. That LLC then can give to a super PAC or advocate on my behalf. But the more common route is through a 501c6 trade association, which is a nonprofit entity in U.S. law. That it's basically a union for corporations. It's a way for corporations of similar interests to bundle money and then spend it politically. So, the animal ag industry has, half a dozen different corporate trade associations. There's the different pork associations, the beef cattlemen associations. There's also the Meat Institute of America. That that's the group that has spent a lot of money influencing public policy. In particular, the ProPublica reported earlier this year that they actually ghostwrote the presidential executive order that kind of compelled slaughterhouses to stay open even through the pandemic and keep forcing workers to show up or risk losing their jobs. And then there's 501c4 issue advocacy. That's another kind of nonprofit group. It has a little bit more restrictions on the way it can spend money, but it can still raise unlimited amounts of money and spend it as long as it's for quote unquote issue advocacy. But the IRS, which governs this type of law, is broadly defined issue advocacy. That's why you see these groups with incredibly benign names, Americans for Freedom, Americans for Tax Reform, Americans for Prosperity. And as long as they say that they're advocating for a public policy issue, they can raise and spend unlimited amounts of secret money. Now, looking at the campaign finance disclosures that are disclosed the candidate disclosures, the PACs, the party committees. You're going to see a lot of different types of individuals. It's important to be fair-minded in looking at all these disclosures. You might see a lot of donations from a certain company. Maybe you'll see donations from individuals who say they work for Smithfield or Google or United Health or whatever, but not every individual is the same. When we're reporting on public policy, on politics, I think it's important to make a distinction between people who have power, who are donating on behalf of the corporation or to shape public policy to benefit a corporation or an interest group, versus someone who is a mid-level or low-level employee who's donating because that's how they personally feel. You can call the person and ask why they donated. That's maybe number one. But number two is just looking at their job title. Someone who is a registered lobbyist for a company, a CEO, a CFO. I think it's fair to assume or to collect those names as representatives of a company, versus someone who's a secretary or working on the line in a factory. A lot of times those donations are just an individual who read a news story and decided to give. So important to look at those distinctions. Spouse donations provide a way for donors to essentially double the campaign finance limits. So you'll see a CEO and often their spouse will also donate the exact same amount, so they can effectively double. Straw donations in the U.S. are illegal, meaning that when employees give, they can't be reimbursed by their employer. But this is a scandal that keeps happening. There could be federal charges if you find evidence of this. Mining corporations, a lot of other corporations have gotten in trouble for this in recent years. Also, company PACs will promote campaign giving not directly, but through the company's PAC. And I think that's a fair argument to say, okay, well, this money is certainly done through to benefit the corporation, because the corporate PACs controlled by a company, certainly serve the company's interests. And then also, just getting back to the thing I mentioned earlier, there's such a growing phenomenon as there's more and more scrutiny about the type of money politicians raise. I'm sure you've seen, if you follow U.S. politics, Sunrise campaign, other groups that are calling for politicians to reject bank money, to reject corporate PAC money, to reject fossil fuel money. Again, we see this shell game. A lot of politicians ran in the blue wave in 2018 as Democrats, saying they will reject corporate money, but then they kind of received corporate money just through these third-party PACs. Something to keep an eye out for. And then there are other incidental and kind of non-traditional ways to find campaign finance money. The Foreign Agent Registration Act, this was a law passed in the 1930s to guard against Nazi influence in the US. It now governs, it's always governed all foreign influence in US politics from foreign governments. And these disclosures require foreign agents for American agents for a foreign government to disclose their donations domestically. And so if you look at what agents are disclosing as they register, they will show campaign finance disclosures before they show up in other databases. Something to keep an eye out for. We've done quite a few stories looking at corporations as they go bankrupt. When a company goes through Chapter 11 reorganizing, they have to disclose their creditors, their debts, different claims they have against them. And in many cases, we found dark money by looking at these corporations and showing that they have creditors to secret money groups that are influencing politicians. Social media, I think politicians have gotten way more savvy about this, but every so often you find that politicians who are gathering for fundraisers with corporate executives, with other powerful people, someone will post it on Instagram or post it on Twitter that they're there with them. And you can kind of connect the dots just by keeping a very close track of that. Because of shareholder pressure from a number of good government groups, from unions and some pensions, we've seen a bigger push for publicly traded corporations to voluntarily disclose more campaign finance and lobbying data. This is very spotty. This is not done in a particularly regulated way, but a number of large publicly traded corporations are now doing this. For some pharmaceutical companies, they're actually now mandated by law, especially in the EU. But something to keep in mind, I don't believe many of the factory farm interests have complied with these or volunteered to disclose their political influence spending, but that could change, and I could be wrong about that. There's a lot of big ag interests and farming interests out there. I mentioned how 501c money is typically secret, that the money that they raise, but the money outgoing when they spend is often public. It's disclosed on their forms. The problem with that is that it's disclosed about a year after it's spent, so it's good for kind of connecting the dots in the historical record, not for real-time reporting, but something to keep in mind. And then for corporations and unions that are governed by the NLRB, that's the federal statute for organizing a labor union, there's a variety of disclosures for how corporations spend and how unions spend to influence these organizing campaigns. And those are called the LM forms you can find at the Labor Department. And just some other thoughts on this. Highly regulated industries tend to have their own distinct disclosure system, registration system, that incidentally you can find campaign finance spending. Every state has a state insurance commissioner that governs insurance policies on healthcare and car insurance. Some of those states have interesting disclosures on how insurance companies spend. The federal government and many state governments have special regulatory regimes on interstate pipelines. We know, for example, the folks who are leading the Joe Biden campaign, who are advising him, they come from a firm called SKD Knickerbocker. From some of these interstate pipeline disclosures, we know that those, while advising Democrats, this consulting firm has done a lot of work for Dominion Energy and other utility interests that are building these gas pipelines all across the East Coast. That they're working for these interests, and we know through these disclosures. So something to keep in mind. Oh, and also the pension funds. A lot of state pension funds are highly regulated. They have to just, for the money managers who are managing these multi-billion-dollar contracts for people's retirements, there are both restrictions and disclosures for the types of political money they spend. I wanted to get a little bit to my reporting for this. I do a variety of reporting on politics, on public policy. One of the longer features that I've published in the last 2 years is this piece that we did earlier this year. It's called The Playbook for Poisoning the Earth. It's a historical piece looking at the rise of neonicotinoids. These are the most commonly used insecticides in the world. They're coming under increasing regulation in the EU, but in the rest of the world, in Asia, in Latin America, and particularly in the US, you can find it everywhere. You can find it in landscaped gardens, all across corporate agriculture, even in lots of small shops for buying, ornamental trees and flowers and that type of thing. So, and these insecticides are highly toxic to a range of insects, including beneficial insects, pollinators, birds, and other forms of life, incredibly water soluble. So they're leaching from agricultural sites into the wider environment and causing a lot of havoc. This is a long story, some of which some of the documents are from a source. I can't talk about that, but a lot of this piece that goes into the history of this chemical compound, how it grew, how it became so popular, and how the industry has defeated every attempt to regulate it in the U.S. in particular. A lot of these, reading this piece, you'll find that a lot of this stuff that I have is not, it's not rocket science. It's working from my computer, filing document requests, reading academic studies, and trying to understand the ways in which these regulations were defeated, that the public opinion on these debates have been shifted, and how the industry has lobbied policymakers to make sure that no action is taken effectively in the US. So you'll see a lot of quotes from academics who have been paid by the industry to write papers or to make public statements that are favorable to the pesticide and agrochem industries. A lot of this was done through federal Freedom of Information Act requests, but also state level. Public universities, University of Maryland, University of California, et cetera, typically fall under state public records request laws. So I filed many requests. Each state has its own system, its own laws regarding public interest requests. So, familiarize yourself with those. Florida has a very strong one. Maryland has a pretty decent one. Washington State has a pretty decent one. And you can request all kinds of documents, whether those are budget documents, whether they are emails. Some states and some institutions are more forthcoming than others. But something that you can use. And if you read my piece, you'll see that it's clear that a lot of these were public records that I obtained that were used in reporting some of the dynamics around universities in the piece. For any kind of big sweeping story, I think it's, especially a niche topic like this, it's important to just look at everything that's been said on social media, look at everything that's been posted on YouTube. A lot of the influence attempts by industry, their ads, their videos are posted on YouTube. So just kind of dissecting, who's appearing in these videos, that can yield a lot of information. The PBS series that ran years ago, but basically push back on claims that neonics are dangerous to bees. And in the piece, you can see that I found that the pesticide industry had underwritten those series of stories. But that was, again, just finding lots of information on YouTube and social media and connecting the dots. And, we haven't really talked about business reporting. That's almost a subject for another entire session. But let's see, how do we stop this? The other kind of dynamic here is that you can, for publicly traded corporations in particular, there's so much information that's out there in the public. For publicly traded companies, one of the main disclosures is the annual 10K, which gives kind of a summary of a company's business, its revenues, its liabilities, who's leading it, what are its, what is it looking forward to, what are its kind of risk factors. I used a lot of 10Ks of various publicly traded pesticide companies. Bayer, Monsanto, some of the two neonic players have now merged. And some of the 10K information is in the piece, but the other kind of, I think, underutilized resource is that for publicly traded companies, they have to provide a regular series of presentations to investors and answer questions from analysts. And you see this in the kind of annual investor presentation, the quarterly earnings call, but also these presentations given to banks and other investors. So Bayer, which developed some of the very first neonics, it's really been a leader in the industry for a very long time. A breakdown by a per product basis on various neonic products. From as far as I know, outside of industry sources, it's not really publicly easily accessible information, but Bayer, for a variety of banks in France and the US, provide presentations in the early aughts explaining their whole strategy around neonics, how much of a revenue source and how important it is for the company, and has a whole series of PowerPoints and audio you could find on the internet. And just digging into that, looking for that, you can suss out a lot of new information that is otherwise very difficult to find. I think that's it. That's all I prepared for today, but I really like to get to the questions.
Thank you, Lee, so much. That was an awesome introduction into how people can add more flair to their investigations and find more information and really go deep on what it is they're looking at. And a lot of stuff there that I think that, well, myself and the people on this call didn't know about. So yeah, thank you so much. It's a lot to digest. I'm curious, this is a question from me. How long, like how much time did you actually put into writing the Playbook article? Like how long did that take you from start to finish?
Well, I mean, I'm a little embarrassed to say it took me a long time. I mean, this was interesting to me. I'm so interested in just so many different topics. I cover labor, politics, tax policy, defense contracting. This is something that I tangentially knew about. I've heard about the debates around, and I've written about some previous pesticide issues. I've written about chlorpyrifos, which is its own bag of worms. It's another neurotoxin that's actually very harmful to human beings, and it's been banned all around the world, but still used in the U.S. and in particular in California. But I wasn't particularly informed about neonics, and so after coming across some new information that hadn't been reported, it dawned on me that I should get better acquainted with this. I read all the journalism available. I went out and talked to activists and scientists and beekeepers and other people in the field. And after about 6 months of just trying to understand the contours and looking at what had already been done, I tried to forge a piece that was both comprehensive and presented a lot of new information, because this is an old story. If you look at Le Monde and some other great French newspapers, they've done a lot of reporting on this. And I really don't want to reinvent the wheel. I want to do something truly unique. So I spent about a year, half of which just kind of gathering information, and the other half piecing it together, writing this piece.
Cool. Yeah, I thought you were going to say like 10 years. You've been doing it since 2009, like, okay, we have a couple of questions here as well. Okay, here's one. How do you vet sources on social media? They go on to say, I'm sure tips and leads come in through all different platforms, but do you have a process for assessing the trustworthiness of a source that you find on, say, Twitter? And does your vetting process change based on where the source finds you?
It's a good question. I think, there are a lot of people on social media and on the internet more broadly that send false information. There are some cases that have been documented. I've done reporting on this, that interest groups sometimes send fake documents just to destroy the credibility of grassroots organizations or journalists. So you really have to be careful. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet, and I think it just requires documentation. Talking to someone who's anonymous on the internet is one thing, but seeing what they actually have to provide and then verifying the documents that they send you is everything. If someone just says, I saw some horrible crime, but I have no evidence to present, the threshold for reporting that is extremely high. Like you absolutely need a second or third person to verify whatever they witnessed. It's easier if they have some kind of tangible thing they can send you that you can then vet. I mean, obviously documents can be forged, but I think the threshold is different.
Cool, thank you. And we have a few more coming in now. One, in countries like mine, India, the government has done their best to hide and conceal as much information as possible, especially when it comes to animal agriculture. How does one search for information in this scenario and also pitch to media organizations, most of which are pro-government?
That second part of the question, I really can't say, because I don't understand the dynamics in India, and the media landscape. It's probably unique in ways that I can't understand. The internet provides a lot of new ways to report outside of traditional media sources like newspapers and magazines. Finding like-minded individuals who can back you up and help you pitch. And once you gain kind of viral coverage of a news story, it can put pressure on the institutional media to cover your stories. Now, in terms of just finding unique information in India, I can't say. But what I will say, what I've noticed among a lot of animal ag and big ag, including pesticide, chemical interests, is that this industry is incredibly concentrated. It's a small number of companies that really control the global market in terms of pesticides, in terms of the trade of pork and cattle, and farming equipment too. There's not a lot of companies, and many of them are based in either China, the U.S., or Europe. And I think if you're reporting on ag in India, look at if they're not disclosing in India their corporate business model, their priorities, they might be disclosing in another country, but talking about India. So if you're looking at John Deere or Bayer, look at disclosures in the U.S. or in Europe and what they're telling investors or what they're telling customers about what they're doing in India. That might sound like a circuitous route, but it might be just simply more accessible if you look at how these industries are regulated in other countries, even if they're operating in India.
That makes a lot of sense. And to follow up on that, like if somebody is wanting, like for when you've done pieces that are exposing animal suffering, and like I said in the beginning, like you do tend to kind of focus on the other aspects, like bringing out the point of the criminal, like the corruption within the justice system, for example. Like how do you pitch these kind of stories based on animal agriculture to editors to get them excited about it?
Well, I think just generally, no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, or how educated you are, or where you stand in terms of class in America, there's this general, unless you're extremely rich, there's a general feeling of being left out, of feeling that normal people, ordinary people, don't have their voice heard, which is true. It's not a conspiracy. The system is rigged in many respects, and when you're looking at animal ag stories, so many of our laws, so much of of the business model is shaped by a small number of companies. Small farmers, regular workers, consumers, people who are advocating for animal rights. They aren't part of the process. They don't have money. They don't have market power. So for a lot of these stories, in terms of how activists are being prosecuted, or look this year, we did a story earlier this summer about how Smithfield, one of the largest pork producers in the world, had compelled their employees to keep showing up at these slaughterhouses, even when they were sick, had provided bonuses to them to keep working even if they were showing symptoms, did not provide critical PPE, did not provide the plexiglass dividers that could have mitigated some of the spread, really cut corners in every way possible in a lot of these plants. And this was a big health concern, even for folks, and just a human rights concern for a lot of folks who are even outside the animal rights community in general. But it's also a political story about power. And, we did a story this summer showing that, in the US, many of the prosecutors are elected. Local DAs raise money from interest groups when they run and become prosecutors of cities. Attorneys general of different states that are charged with enforcing these laws are also elected, so they can receive money or they can receive outside big corporate influence. And we found a filing this summer after so many families of immigrant workers, of people in these slaughterhouses were affected by this pandemic, that Smithfield and other animal ag interests suddenly increased their donations to prosecutors in this country. So they're very concerned about how these laws are going to be enforced, or how these laws might be nullified, affecting the public interest. So that's just a classic story of large corporations bending the system towards their will. And I think for folks who are outside of the animal rights movement, or really for anyone, this is a story that's familiar to them, that's an outrage, that shows that if you're a regular worker or a consumer, you don't get to shape how prosecutors, which laws they pick to enforce. But if you're a big corporation, you have a seat at the table. You can cut a $50,000 check and then pick up the phone with the people who are charged with carrying out the law.
Yeah, great. So this actually leads quite well into the next question, which is about like speaking to sources, potential sources. So they say, Are there strategies you would recommend when it comes to interviewing people from industries who tend to be reluctant to talk to journalists?
Yeah, no, and so, companies are increasingly using NDAs and pressuring workers not to speak out. So it can be difficult. I think it's important to take every precaution possible not to name a source unless they're willing or it's absolutely necessary. But if you agree to anonymity, that's you know that is a rule that is good as law, even if it's not technically law. You should always abide by it. I've always protected my sources. Um, you know, if someone reaches out to you, all you have is your integrity. They have to trust you. You really can't violate that sacred oath. And it's also important to use a variety of anonymous messaging services. Signal is a great app that can't be tapped, and the phone companies don't have a record of your text messages. You can turn on deleting messages. Of course, it's not perfect. If someone loses access to their phone, or if they're using a work phone, someone takes it, they can see the messages. Nothing is bulletproof, but it does provide a layer of secrecy when you're talking to sources. And of course, people leak or whistleblow for a variety of reasons. It's important to verify any information that you're talking with someone about, and just put yourself in their shoes. They could risk their job, they could be sued. So even if the story that they're presenting to you is very tempting, very juicy information, it's important just to consider all the aspects here.
Yeah, would you recommend any? So I know there are certain journalists that they try and keep everything on the record, but they take the person out, for drinks, and they kind of try and make them feel more comfortable so that this isn't work time. Would you recommend that kind of getting to know sources as a way in?
Yeah, it's not really my specialty, but it's a completely valid form of journalism to really get to know lots of sources and create personal bonds that can lead to scoops. It's just not my style. I'm more of a data document person, but what I tend to do is find patterns in documents, or interesting revelations in documents, and then go to experts and try to understand them better. And a lot of that involves the process that you're describing of getting to know the most well-versed and intelligent people in a certain field is very important, because a lot of if you're reporting a very wonky story, it's important you get the facts right.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have one here. What are your top 3 skills that you would recommend developing as an investigative journalist?
Well, it's really hard to rank them off the top of my head. But going back to the presentation, just open the Wall Street Journal today. Look at the New York Times. How many of those stories? You're not going to necessarily beat the reporters who have a close relationship with the politicians who are feeding them stuff on a daily basis, or with business leaders who are feeding them stuff on a daily basis. I mean, maybe you will one day, but it's perhaps for someone who's new to the field a competitive disadvantage to think about that way. Think about ways that are objective, that you can improve your skills on. Try to become an expert in a certain data area. I talked about campaign finance, but this could be applied to so many other things. If you're reporting on criminal justice, really get to know the criminal justice system in your local jurisdiction. Understand the courthouse, when things are filed, how the docket works, who are the prosecuting attorneys and the defense attorneys. Understand basically the contours of the law that you're trying to report on. Or if it's of a different area, if you're a business reporter, understand the different filings and the regulations that apply to the businesses. If you're reporting on animal ag, become an expert on the different filings that are expected of industrial agriculture, whether that's environmental regulations, labor regulations. There aren't many regulations for animal welfare, but for the few that do exist, just become an expert in the laws that do apply to the industry, and how you can report them out when there are disclosures or lawsuits.
Yeah, so you think that actually focusing much closer on the law, focusing on like actual legal injustices, looking at like, you know, the corruption of money within, you know, who's being funded by who and who's paying for what, you know, laws to be passed, etc., is a better route than say talking about the suffering of the animals, like the, you know, the sentient being and that type of angle.
Look, I mean, I'm describing very much from my perspective. I read reporting on a daily basis that shapes my worldview, that takes a different, you know, approach to journalism. You know, I'm incredibly concerned about the growing class divide in America. We have a winnowing middle class, growing number of people who are living paycheck to paycheck, who are going hungry, particularly because of this pandemic. And one way to report on that is my approach of looking at how big industries get together and prevent, you know, effective taxation, effective social services, and other programs that might mitigate this growing class divide. But another way is just talking to people who are affected by a crisis and telling really emotionally powerful personal stories. I mean, the Washington Post earlier this month had this incredible story going to these abandoned hotels in Central Florida that, you know, the electric company, the water company shut them off. They've basically become squatting. People are squatting at them and living in absolute squalor. And it's these basically American favelas that are just growing across the country. And looking at that as an anecdote, as kind of like a little perspective on a growing pattern. And that's, you know, that was incredible journalism. That's also important to do. So, you know, I'm describing how to do investigative journalism from my point of view, from a way that I've kind of I've focused on and developed over the last decade. But it's certainly not the only way. And I wouldn't say to only do it this way. This is just the way I've done it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting approach, and I think it certainly pulls people who have been, you know, animal rights activists who want to be writers into a different way of thinking about it, which I think is really useful. So thinking about like COVID and your reporting, you say obviously you spend a lot of your time on your computer anyway, you know, looking at documents and doing that kind of stuff. Have you learned any different techniques like to your way of investigating since COVID? Has it altered anything that you do?
Well, you know, a big part of my reporting is also just going to places where powerful people convene and being the fly on the wall and trying to understand their approach and what they're attempting to do in society. And I can't do that anymore as much. So COVID has radically changed that. You know, I used to go to campaign events, to industry conferences, and really just try to soak up as much information as possible and understand what are the stories here, who has power, and how are they exercising that power. I mean, that's just kind of basic approach to politics and to public policy reporting is really vital to what I do. And so now I've been kind of sequestered to only doing the internet stuff. But the one benefit here is that a lot of conferences, a lot of industry events are migrating to what we're doing. They're on Zoom. So, you know, some of these events aren't open to the public, but many are. So I think you could take this crisis as an opportunity to learn online from conferences. Normally you'd have to fly to, you know, Phoenix or London or whatever to attend, but now you can, if you're interested in animal ag or healthcare or what have you, it's possible that some of these conferences where a lot of useful and new information is being presented, you can just log in and take notes by yourself from the comfort of your living room. So that, you know, that's a possibility. It really depends on, I think, tracking more obscure groups where powerful people can convene, and then seeing if they're open to the public and if you can log in.
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of newsletters about the poultry and the beef industry in America that have a lot of events that have been about how they're mitigating, you know, the repercussions of COVID. And I know they've been doing a lot of conferences that do appear to be open for anyone to attend.
Well, that's a great reporting opportunity, I think.
Yeah. Okay, and we have another one here. What about writing a story on what laws there are for the animals and what laws there are around labeling? What does humanely raised actually mean in lay terms? Even this seems like something that is largely unknown to consumers.
Look, I don't know the law for the humane labeling, but I think that's a perfect story. Why we have some labels and what those labels actually entail is incredibly interesting and I think resonates with a lot of consumers and just regular people. And these labels are kind of bizarre because some of them are, I think, mostly branding, but actually breaking down. There's so many elements you could do to approach the story. When politicians or policymakers propose more stringent labeling, who stops that? Who shapes it? Who actually sets the rules around those labels? When a label is applied and it seems to be voluntary, actually following through and saying, well, okay, it says humanely raised. Let's go through the sourcing. Let's go to the farm and actually verify those claims. Verifying a claim by a business or a politician is kind of journalism 101. If a business or a politician makes a strong claim about serving the public interest or serving their constituents or their customers, finding out if that claim is true or not, that's really the basics of journalism. So the labeling story is great. And, there's a big fight in half a dozen states or maybe more now around the label. The beef industry, the meat industry, the dairy industry is fighting to use the power of the law to stop, oat milk or, alternative proteins from being labeled as a meat product. They have to, they're using their market power to crush this growing competitor. They're coercing states to say that you're not allowed to sell these food products unless they have, kind of ridiculous labels on them that remind consumers that this is not an animal egg thing, but then also can't even use the word milk. It's a little bit silly, but it's clear what they're doing. And I think there's been quite a few interesting stories on this, but there's so much more to be done because this is obviously a priority by the animal ag industry. They don't want to see a competition.
And is that part of also kind of trying to muddy the waters, like they were with the toxins that you talked about in the Playbook article?
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of
I mean, so much of this is public relations. It's public managing. I mean, we live in a democracy where consumers and voters have so much power, but that creates incentives just to manipulate public opinion so that people don't exercise their own rights. So looking at these kind of sophisticated efforts to shape public opinion through the media, through institutions, through other places that people gather their information, I think is vital. It's just as important as kind of the more traditional campaign finance or regulatory policymaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that last note, we did actually recently publish an article looking directly at the labeling and certified humane. So we'll link to that in the write-up of this lecture. We have one more question, I think, and then we'll have to call it a day. Okay. Do you think Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model or a variation of it exists? And if so, how do you navigate it as an investigative journalist?
Well, I think there's kind of a herd mentality among journalists. There's a competition for awards. There's a competition to kind of add to the narrative of the day. You just have to be kind of aware of this social dynamic and be aware that everyone's trying to manipulate you. When a source comes to you with information, oftentimes that's vital information that needs to be disclosed, but it's oftentimes an interest group or an individual that has an agenda that's very personal, selfish, that's unrelated to the public interest. Sometimes those two intersect, not always, So just being aware of the social dynamics of working in the media and in this kind of rat race for scoops and narrative building, and being aware of the interest groups and kind of unsavory figures and politicians and corporations that are always attempting to manipulate you or shape what you report. You're going to be influenced by both if you work in the media, but being cognizant of both dynamics, trying to remain independent and truthful and fair-minded. It's vital, I think, for journalism, especially in this day and age when we have so much salacious tabloid-driven news. Absolute decline of the traditional news media in the U.S., where thousands and thousands of reporters and other people who work at media outlets have been laid off in the last decade. The decline of local media, it's a tragedy. And there's two dynamics of the herd mentality driven by the social factors of being a journalist and kind of the inherent nature of digital and social media driven news, and the kind of manipulation that comes from special interests. just be wary of that and try not to be overly influenced by it.
I think that's a really great point and a good place to end it. I think if people apply that thinking as well to when they're writing opinion pieces, like in the animal protection space, we get a lot of opinion articles. And if we apply that thinking to those and we start to actually be mindful of these like other players, then we start to add more weight to what it is that we're saying and get more people to hear us. So yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Lee. It's been an absolute pleasure having you share all your wisdom with us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for doing what you're doing.
Awesome. Well, great. I'm going to just quickly mention what our next session is. We've got the next session on the 22nd of October at 10 a.m. again. This is Collaboration and Activism, Strength Through Alliances. We have Ariana Shverdi of Encompass, Leah Garcias of Mercy for Animals, Christopher Sebastian, lecturer, author, researcher, and Sentient Media Fellow. And we're going to explore and shine a spotlight on communities of color, the queer community, immigrants, farm workers, and more. So that's on the 22nd of October. But Lee, thank you so much again, and have a fantastic day.
You too. Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.